We can sit around in the alternative media and we can moan about the fact that listings in Google are constantly being manipulated through algorithms, or we can do something about it.
Hello, and tonight's headlines.
The Iconic Media Group is a genuine alternative.
I never fully switch off. It's almost like having the radio on in the background.
What is the reaction to that from within the industry?
Well, I hide a lot.
Hello, welcome to Real Education with Lana.
However, we want to grow this into being one of the biggest independent platforms, if not the biggest independent platform in the world.
I brought in Max Egan to talk about it. Mr. Egan, no need for introductions, but I've done it anyway. Say hello to Iconic.
And welcome to the very first episode of Amanda's Secret Chamber.
I felt it, I know what pain feels like. It's horrible to suffer mentally because everything's here. It's just in here.
This gives the strong impression that we know what we're talking about.
I want to leave this world having made the biggest difference I can.
A genuine alternative that will cast a light on subjects that the mainstream media, and to be fair, large swathes of the alternative media, either can't or won't.
David, it's an absolute pleasure and a joy to see you again, and it's amazing all that conspiracy renegade bad boy keeps you looking younger and younger, and I'm very thankful as we become elderly.
Well, you guys are aging younger, so I don't know how you're doing it, but both of you are looking really good.
Well, it's I suppose when you're focused on something, you haven't got time to get older, and you also start to understand, as we appreciate the true nature of reality, the true nature of who we are, as opposed to what we're told we are, and we appear to be experiencing what we are, that all these mind programs, like aging and such like, are like software programs in so many ways. There are programs, information programs, playing out through the body, and they are fundamentally affected by our perception of reality. So if you perceive yourself to be someone who has a life of 70 years and 10, whatever, and through that life you age in a certain way, and when you get to this age, well, you don't do that anymore, and when you get to this age, this happens, well, you are following the software. But that's all it is. It's an information program. It's what the body is. And if you can change your perception and not believe or accept that you must follow these programs just because it appears that everyone else does, then you can change them. I'll give you a quick example. I was a professional footballer a long time ago, and I finished my career with arthritis at the age of 21, rheumatoid arthritis. I was told by the doctors I could well be in a wheelchair by the time I was in my 30s. And I thought, well, I won't. I'm not having it. And they gave me some tablets. It was in a big jar. And they said, take 3 a day. And I said, well, will these get rid of the arthritis? You know, I was only 19 at the time. Played football with arthritis for another 2 years. And they said, no, but take the pain away. I said, well, you know, stick them. What's that going to do to my body? So I thought, I'm not having it. And I went through my life, and the arthritis progressed. And at one point, I was walking through Heathrow Airport, and I had to shuffle my feet along the ground because I couldn't lift them. If I was doing something like that, turning a door knob or something, it was agony. All this. And then I started to get in really to the nature of reality, who we are, how it all works, and how...
The power of thoughts and the power of intention.
Yeah, in fact, you know, the realization that our experienced reality is merely a holographic projection of our perceived reality. What you believe you perceive, what you perceive you experience. And so when I got into all this, I thought, well, hold on a minute. So why have I got this arthritis progressing? And I thought, well, obviously it doesn't have to, because my mind can take control of it, because that's the real governor. And so I decided I weren't going to have the arthritis progressing, and I was going to roll it back. And here I am at 67 now, with arthritis I've had since rheumatoid arthritis, supposed to progress and get worse and worse and worse since I was in my teens. And it's as irrelevant to me now than it's ever been. It's almost like I don't have it. I just get on with my life. I'm in no pain. I'm very active, walk a lot. And the difference is not a jar of pills, but my mind deciding I'm going to control my reality and not my reality control me, because we have the choice. We can live life, or we can let life live us. And
so, David, what you're talking about is how the ability that we co-create or create our reality through our thoughts and feelings. And at the United Intentions Foundation, at the UI Media Network, that's what we speak all the time about. Our perception creates our reality. Change your perception, you change what you experience, right? So you're saying you lived your life with understanding at a young age to the point where you can take that over. So before we get into specifically about where we are with your latest book, The Trigger, which is a phenomenal book. I mean, basically, it's the 9/11 catalyst of how we're the process of enslaving humanity. And it's fascinating. And before we get there, just tell me really quickly, and you can describe perhaps how you now believe, or you have believed, how you create your reality here. This is the governor, as you said. What was your trigger? What was your trigger point? What sent you from pulling yourself out of the matrix here? And this is, I know, a little while ago, but pulling yourself out of the matrix, you can realize that you're going to go down the truth seeking and risk everything, because you have, as an icon for so many decades, has risked everything. And not that we need to get into everything you risk, but what was that defining moment for you?
Well, it's quite a long story, but I'll make it as brief as possible. I was a professional footballer. My career finished with arthritis, and I went into journalism. I worked on newspapers, I worked on radio, I became a national television presenter with the BBC. And then I got interested in the environmental movement. There was a lot of environmental destruction going on in Britain at the time. We're talking the 1980s. And I got involved in the British Green Party, which I'm glad I did, because it gave me a fantastic insight into the mentality that's now driving this climate change hoax, which is being used to transform human society. We'll get into that, I'm sure, as we go along. But then came, what would it be, 1989. And through that year, something very strange started to happen. When I was in a room alone, it was as if I wasn't alone. It was as if there was something there, a presence. All this was new to me at the time. And as 1989 unfolded, the presence got stronger and stronger and stronger, to the point in early 1990, I'm in a hotel room in London called the Kensington Hilton, working for the BBC. And I'm in a hotel room alone, and the presence was so potent, so tangible. I actually said into the room, if there's something there, would you please contact me, because you're driving me up the wall. A few days later, I'm with my son Gareth, who's a little boy then, big strapping singer-songwriter now, and we were going to have some lunch at a cafe restaurant on the seafront here where I live, but it was full, it was packed, so we were going to go up into the town. But then as we were about to do that, someone stopped me, wanted to talk about football, which was going on that day. And when the conversation was finished, I realized that Gareth weren't there, but I knew where he would be. It was in this shop, sold newspapers and tourist souvenirs. And I walked in, and as I'm standing at the door, and he's there reading some books about steam trains, the presence around me, the atmosphere around me changed. Now, I didn't know what it was then, but I know now the electromagnetic field around me had changed. And as it did so, it was like my feet were burning, like again, electromagnetism, but I didn't know at the time, were pulling my feet to the ground. And I heard not this voice, but a very strong thought form pass through my mind, which said, go and look at the books on the far side. And I'm thinking, what? And I knew the books in this shop, and they were all romantic novels. What do I want to read them for? But I walked across towards them in a daze. And when I got there, there's one book in the middle of all the romantic stuff. And
don't mention the book's name yet, David, because we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back, guys. We're talking to David Icke on a cliffhanger of which book transformed his life to be the David Icke he is today.
This is great, David.
Stay tuned, guys. A lot more to come. We're going in deep today with the one and only David Icke. We'll be right back. All right, we are back with not only David Icke, who's calling all the way from the UK, but also Daniel Brinkley, two international authors, famous international authors, and truth-seeking renegades. And we're going to be discussing David's book, The Trigger here in a minute. But first, David was just finishing a story about how what was his defining moment when he had this beyond the veil experience that we normally you hear stories, and I know Daniel's no stranger to that experience, but he was about to say that he was just about to pull a book out he was directed to by some unknown energy or source. And what was that name of that book?
Well, it was a book called Mind to Mind by a lady called Betty Shine, who was a professional psychic. And I picked that book up because something attracted me to it, probably overwhelmingly because it was so different to all the others. And I turned it over, see what it was all about, and I read the blurb and I saw the word psychic, and she was British. And so my immediate thought, after all this year of this presence I couldn't explain, was I wonder if this lady will pick up what's been around me. So I read the book in 24 hours, wrote to her, went to see her. And I told her nothing, absolutely nothing, because you don't want to lead them along so that they get a gist for what's happening. Told them nothing. And so I went there a couple of times, and the reason I said I went, and in one way it was true, she did this hands-on healing, which is like an exchange of energy. And so I told her I wanted to see if she'd help my arthritis. But on the third occasion, I'm on this medical type bench in her front room, and I felt like a spider's web on my face. Again, I knew nothing of what was going on. It was an electromagnetic field, obviously. And it hit me because I remembered reading in her book that when other levels of reality are trying to lock into you and make a connection to you, you feel like a spider's web on your face, because on this level, it's an electromagnetic connection. And I said nothing to her at all. I'm just sitting there thinking, I read this in her book. And then she's doing this on just after my left knee at the time. And then after about 10 or 15 seconds, she launches her head back and says, I've got to close my eyes for this one. This is powerful. And she goes on to tell me that she's seeing a presence in her mind who is telling her to tell me a series of things. Amazing when you think all these years later, and what has happened. I was being told in March 1990 that I was going to go out on a world stage and reveal great secrets. One of the lines was, one man cannot change the world, but one man can communicate the message that can change the world. And that I was going to face enormous opposition, but, quote, they would always be there to protect me, and many other things. And everything I was told that day and the following week, and the last time I went to see her.
How old were you then?
I was, what would I be? It was, I was born in, you're good at maths, so I was born in 1952, and this was in 1990, so you work that
out.
All right, 40s.
About 40, yeah.
Yeah,
okay.
That's about right, yeah. And so many things then started to happen to me, including an extraordinary happening in Peru, on a hill at a place called Siyustani.
And David, I remember this one of the best stories that for me that made you so human. That was here as a human being. I'd never heard this first part, but I remember you telling me about that experience in Peru, and it so humanized the transformation of who you were as a footballer to who you had become as a spiritual conscious being, to who you've evolved as a knowledgeable presenting being. So please tell this story.
Well, what happened was I wrote a book about what was happening to me, because pretty much soon after the Betty Shine experience, only a matter of 2 or 3 months, the BBC sacked me. They didn't renew my contract out of nowhere. But obviously, from another level, you realize later, actually, that was exactly what was meant to happen. And I wrote this book called Truth Vibrations. And I tell you why, because I called it that. Because in these communications I'm talking about, I was told that a great transformation was coming. In fact, it had already begun. And a vibrational change was coming. That was going to act like a spiritual alarm clock, basically, and it was going to wake humanity up from its slumber. I was told that the ones who were most awake were going to be affected first, and then even people who at that time were solid gold asleep, you might say, were actually going to start being affected by it. And another thing that I was told at the same time is that this vibrational change was going to bring to the surface all that had been hidden. All the things that had been hidden from us were going to be brought to the surface where we could see them. And so I dubbed this transformation the Truth Vibrations. And I called the book that. But when I'd written it, and we go into kind of late 1990, early 1991, suddenly I got this feeling out of nowhere that I had to go to Peru. I mean, I'd never been to Peru. I knew nothing about Peru. I saw their football team play once, but that's all. And I got on a plane to Peru purely on intuition, which is what I've been guiding me and driving me ever since. And amazing things happen in Peru of a spiritual, paranormal nature. And it ended up where another long story I won't go into, but I ended up on this hill in Peru at a place called Siyustani. Siyustani is an Inca site not far from Puno, on Lake Titicaca.
Titicaca.
Yeah.
Know it well.
And so anyway, I'm in this hotel, and it's called the Siyustani, and there's pictures of this Inca site all over the hotel. And these pictures were like saying, come to me. I was, I thought, I need to go there. So I go there the next day, and I look around. It's beautiful. There's a lake, mountains, piercing Peruvian sun, really, really lovely. But when I walked around for an hour, the urge, and it was really powerful, that I had to go there, was not matched by the experience. And I was quite disappointed, thinking, well, what was all that about? So we got in this like bus taxi, as they have in Peru, with a driver and the Peruvian guide who was taking me around the country. And we start to drive away. And a few minutes down the road, still within the Siyustani kind of, location, I'm looking out the window, daydreaming, as I do all the time. And I'm looking at this hill, and all I can hear in my head as I'm looking at this hill is, come to me, come to me, come to me. So at this point, of course, you think you flip, mate. So I asked the guy to stop the bus or the taxi, and got out. I said, I'll only be a few minutes. Well, I was nearly about an hour, because of what happened. And I went up to this hill, and there were kind of stones there in a kind of circle. And I walked into these stones, and I got the same that happened in the newspaper shop, only and then some. Suddenly my feet began to burn, and I felt like a drill going in the top of my head and down through my body, and another flow coming the other way. Then my arms went out at 45 degrees without any kind of conscious decision from me. And I had a very clear thought form, communication, whatever came through my mind, and it said, it will be over when you feel the rain. Clear as day. And there's not a cloud in the sky. I've got a big red nose to prove it on, piercing sun. So I'm like that. And by now, my body's starting to shake and shake. And it got to the point where you could hardly stand. And what was happening is, when you're driving a car and you can't remember the last mile or so because your subconscious has been driving the car. Well, it was like that. I would be out somewhere, and then I'd come back and consciously be aware of where I was. And on one of these occasions when I came back, I noticed that over the distant mountains there was a light grey mist. And I thought, it's raining over those mountains. And the mist got darker. And what happened next, if you put it in a movie, they'd say that's ridiculous. Who wrote this script? This storm came out of the mountains and towards me, stair rod rain. And it was like a straight line coming across towards me. And I'm standing there, and by now my body's shaking like crazy. And I was hit by this deluge, soaked immediately. It was so powerful, the rain. And when it hit me, the energy stopped. And I'm like Bambi now. I can hardly stand up. My arms have been out there all that time. Didn't feel a thing. Now my shoulders are killing me. What followed that, after that, I came back to Britain. And it was like, it was like living in a bubble, and your perception came from the information within the bubble. And then someone popped the bubble. Didn't tell you. Didn't give you any clue what was going to happen. Pop!
Yeah.
And suddenly, concepts, information, perceptions were pouring into my conscious mind.
Download.
It was like pressing too many keys on the computer, and I kind of froze for 3 months. And in the middle of that froze, who am I? What's going on? I went on national television in a major primetime chat show, and
I remember that.
became the resident nutter of Britain for many years that followed.
So that's where the courage comes in place, because I've heard this story over and over again from many different people, have different experiences. Even Tesla himself would download information. Yours is definitely a little more, I'd say, like I said, in a movie, you're on Peru, on a rock, and you're having this experience, the rain comes over. Almost, a Moses experience. And like even referred to earlier, you've had this, you may not be changing the world, but you're going to be communicating information to help perhaps change the world.
And very smartly also.
And well done as well.
Well, the thing is about that, by the way, just very quickly, is, I have this phrase, sometimes life gives you your greatest gifts brilliantly disguised as your worst nightmare. What followed that appearance on the TV show, and the audience was enormous. I mean, we've got about 62 million people in this country. That audience was something like 17 million. Was that I went through a period of absolute, total, historic levels of ridicule. So I couldn't walk down any street in Britain without being laughed at. I couldn't go in a bar, waste of time. I would stand in front of an audience, and it would be like 5, sometimes longer, minutes before the uproar stopped and all the abuse and the ridicule. And that was my great gift disguised as my worst nightmare, because what it did was set me free of the prison that most people live in, which is the fear of what other people think. And I didn't know consciously what was coming down the line in terms of the information I was going to put out, but something
you were on a need-to-know basis.
And I was being cleared out of that fear of what other people think, so that I would put out that information without thinking, oh no, what are people going to say about me? I don't care. I'm interested in the truth, not a statue and a round of applause.
Well, it's funny how you say that. We're going to take another break here in a second, but when you do finally are set free by not caring egoly, in an ego perspective or consciously, of what other people think, and you were forced to, because like you said, you were ridiculed walking down the street because you shared what you believe was your experience, and that was your truth, and it was not accepted, basically, from the mainstream media or whatever else you might have been involved in.
Because it would affect change. They would have to change what they see.
And so you had that experience, and here it is. Now, fast forward, 30 years later, right? When we get back from break, I want to talk about the trigger,
Okay,
and I want to get into the specifics of 5 areas that you speak to, and if you could give me one, maybe 2 examples of each one that comes to you that you feel would be a good indicator of that trigger for the 9/11 guys. We're talking to David Icke. He's not only an international author and researcher, but also a truth seeker.
But let me say something,
and a
too.
renegade.
David, thank you so much for giving us this part of your life in the beginning so that people get a chance to see a lot of people going through the same stuff. I mean, I went through it with being struck by lightning, but to seeing the human being bringing this information forward is so important, so thank you.
Yes, David. And we get back. We are with David Icke and, of course, Daniel Brinkley, and we're discussing the trigger next, which is the 9/11 catalyst. Really, what was its purpose and where we are today because of it? We'll be right back, guys. More to come. Don't go anywhere. All right, we are back with David Icke. And, guys, of course, you know where to reach him, davidicke.com, and also with Daniel Brinkley. And we're discussing life and where we are in this matrix, and more so, the 9/11 conspiracy. Yeah, I said conspiracy, but there is something going on that I think most of us know, but we don't want to look at. And David Icke put a book together that covers just that, what you need to know, what all of us need to know, what happened with the 9/11 experience. And it's a book called The Trigger, The Lie That Changed the World, Who Really Did It and Why. Now, David, it's a phenomenal book, and I mean, it covers so much. I mean, it's a big book. All your books are pretty big books for the most part, because you are very detailed and you research, and you're, like you said, you're a truth seeker. You don't care what people think.
And a lot of it's downloaded, and then he's doing fact check based on an entity transmitting this information into him, and then David gets stuck with having to fact check all that information, which creates the book. So I think that's great.
Well, that's a very important point, Daniel, you just made, because when I started out 30 years ago, consciously on this journey, for the first few years, I would research information and come to conclusions. What's happened for about the last at least 25 is the conclusions have come first, and then the names, dates, places, information to support it have actually followed. That's the way it goes. And it was the same with 9/11. As soon as I saw 9/11, I thought it's a scam. The official stories are absolutely not true. And I spent 2001, what was left of it, and half of 2002 researching 9/11, anything that would move about it. And I produced a book in September 2002 called Alice in Wonderland of the World Trade Center Disaster, why the official story of 9/11 is a monumental lie. And then about a year and a half ago, I thought, I'm going to update that book. So I started out doing it. Within 2 weeks, no. It's not going to be an update. We're starting with a blank sheet of paper, and we're going again. Because the enormous amount of information that there is to connect together about 9/11 and who really did it and why is now enormous. But this is the great thing, of course, or the most important thing in many ways. If you look at a newspaper, you see stories on page 1, stories on page 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And when you see what the agenda for the world is, you can pick out these stories on these different pages and connect them together. But newspapers never do. They're all isolated in and of themselves stories. So 9/11 looks a certain way when you look at it in and of itself. When you connect the dots, it's a completely different story. And so I spent almost every waking minute, because it becomes totally fascinating and absorbing when you're doing this, researching 9/11 for the trigger. And it's not just about 9/11. The 9/11 is the theme. There's lots of other things around it. And if people knew the real story of 9/11, they would see the entirety of human society and where we're going in a completely and utterly different way.
Well, your book describes that. Sorry, Dan.
And it's okay, but that's why Tim and I talked it over, and I said, Tim, we have to get David telling this story so that people can start with something that's America in an election year, ground themselves with a different viewpoint, do their own homework, follow up, but to find David Icke, to get the trigger, now Renegade, and to begin to search the alternative perspective that's existing us around us that you have so thoroughly documented.
And speaking of election year, David, one of the things you mentioned, of course, in your book, The Trigger, is our destruction of our Bill of Rights. And I was wondering if you could maybe give some examples that, from the Patriot Act, from the 9/11 experience, what came out of the 9/11 disaster that actually started eroding, if not destroying, our Bill of Rights.
Do you think any airplane hit the Twin Towers?
I think they hit the Twin Towers. I don't think they hit the Pentagon at all, as people would say if they read the book. But I have this phrase, know the outcome and you'll see the journey. If you know what the outcome is planned to be of where the world is being taken, then what appear otherwise to be random daily happenings suddenly become very clear stepping stones towards that outcome. And one outcome that they wanted was, two outcomes in relation to 9/11. One was to justify wars of mayhem, death, destruction, and conquest and upheaval in the Middle East and North Africa in terms of Libya. And the other one was to find an excuse to delete basic human freedoms. And this comes under that phrase I came up with a long time ago, problem, reaction, solution. You create a problem, you blame someone else for it, you get the unquestioning media to tell the public your version of that problem, even though it's not true. And at stage 2, you're looking for a reaction from the public of outrage, of fear. And one of two things comes from that. Either people are saying, do something, or if not that far, they will accept what you suggest has to be done because of the problem. So you create the problem, you get the reaction, do something, and then you offer openly the solutions to the problems you have covertly created. And if you look at 9/11, even on this level of deleting freedoms, immediately after the attacks, you had the Patriot Act, which had clearly been written by people before that, those attacks, and they took away basic freedoms. Now, in terms of connecting dots, here's a few. The man who was the head, in effect, of the entire 9/11 investigation, actually non-investigation, because the idea was not to find out who did it, but to blame people who didn't do it, so you could hide the people who really did it. And his name was Michael Chertoff. He was the head of the criminal division of the Justice Department, appointed by Boyd Bush, in other words, appointed by Cheney. And he was also the man who wrote the Patriot Act. Not only that, he then became head of Homeland Security to implement the Patriot Act. And as a result of 9/11, of course, we had the so-called war on terrorism, and that has been an ongoing justification for deleting more and more and more freedoms. And there's a technique that goes along with problem, reaction, solution that I call the totalitarian tiptoe, where you know you're going to Z, but if you go in too big a leap, people are going to look up from the game show and say, what's going on? So you go in step, and each step is promoted as in and of itself. But when you know what the outcome is planned to be, which is a global Orwellian state and a merciless police military imposition, and total and constant surveillance, all of which I've been writing about for 30 years, look what's happening, then you see the stepping stones of the totalitarian tiptoe to the the outcome. So if you look at 9/11, they've been able to justify massive deletions of freedoms that existed before, and they've been able to justify the mayhem that they've caused in the Middle East. For instance, within an hour or so of the attacks, a guy called Ehud Barak, who until early 2001 had been the Prime Minister of Israel, went on the BBC and said that basically the person we should suspect is Osama bin Laden, and there should be a war on terror, including the invasion of Afghanistan. So immediately you have the problem. You start naming your villain. This is very important. So there's no like, well, who did it then? Who did it? No, focus attention. This person did it. These people did it, okay? And anything outside of that, well, you know, you're talking nonsense. This is who did it. Therefore, they had the villain immediately, and they had the country, the first one they wanted to go into, Afghanistan, and it's all played out since.
And are still there. We're still there 18 years later.
And David, with all that being said, that was one of the reasons. There was multiple reasons why we wanted to go to Afghanistan and so on the line, which we could discuss. But in reference to the Bill of Rights, one of my biggest concerns here, and you could speak to this as well, is one of the laws was if you are considered a terrorist by our government, you have no rights. You have no Third, Fourth, Fifth Amendment rights here in the United States. Someone could come into your home, arrest you indefinitely. Now, just recently, Homeland Security, in its brilliance, just updated that, where if you're considered a white nationalist, that they actually literally could treat you as if you were a terrorist. So it seems like this is the beginning phases, as you talk about, how they get one foot in and then they expand it so much further type of tyranny.
Yeah, it's what I call the foot in the door technique. You sell a policy and a law on the basis initially of something that people might find reasonable. Like, we've just been attacked, we've got to do this to make sure there's not another attack. And then all you do is constantly widen it. Give you a wonderful example. There is this reflex action response that if you criticize the far-right government in Israel, then you are an anti-Semite. You just hate Jewish people, which is, complete nonsense. What you're doing is you're criticizing a government. And the obvious definition of anti-Semitism would be, which is a misnomer in itself, but that's another thing, would be to hate Jewish people and discriminate against Jewish people because they are Jewish. I mean, that's a perfect description of what people call anti-Semitism. But what's happening now is a new definition has been introduced, which has expanded the definition to now include criticism of Israel and criticism of Zionism, which is a political philosophy. So much so that the French government this week has announced that criticism of Zionism in France is going to be considered anti-Semitism. And
it's going to blow up in their face.
This is exactly the process you see over and over again. You define something and you change the law because of this, and then you expand it and expand it and expand it until it encompasses more and more people. So the simple thing is this: if you are going to control perception, you have to control information, because we get and form our perceptions from information received. Everything from a personal experience to the television news. And if you want to control the perceptions, you must control the information. And what's been happening, thanks to the early years of the internet, they plan to and are in the process of bringing an end to that. We've been able to get a lot of information out across the internet, which has transformed the perceptions of so many people, not just about world events, but about reality itself. They don't want that. And that's why now all this censorship is kicking in through Silicon Valley to censor people putting that information out. So,
David, speaking of censorship, Dave, we got to take another quick break here. But speaking of censorship, we get back. Let's talk about how also in your book, The Trigger, how our abolishment of our free speech has led to, along with, of course, the Bill of Rights, of course, our First Amendment here in the United States, how that is on trial. All right, guys, we're talking to David Icke, the one and only David Icke, international author and freedom fighter, as well as renegade, as well with Daniel Brinkley here in the studio. Guys, much more to come. You're not going to want to miss the rest of this interview. We'll see you in a sec. Don't get lost out there. We are back with David Icke. You can reach him at davidicke.com. We're talking about his latest book, The Trigger. It's all about the 9/11 catalyst that's transforming the world as we speak, and not in a very good way. So, David, I want to say thank you for coming in. And, of course, I'm Tim Ray, the host of the Wake Up Hour, along with Daniel Brinkley. And I want to say thank you for sharing this information, because it is critical, especially now, especially for our audience and our viewers and listeners who never really, who may or may not heard of you, but also have to understand that it's going to be a time when they're going to be staring this in their face. We just talked about the Bill of Rights at jeopardy, the Patriot Act, how there's nothing patriotic about it whatsoever. It's about stealing our individual rights. And I wanted to mention about the freedom of speech being taken away from the 9/11 catalyst. And then we'll get into a little on the actual planes. I know Daniel wants to hear about that as well. Okay. But real quick here, like right now, as you know, back in the day of fascism around the world, the first thing they do is they start burning books, right? They start taking away your freedom of speech in that level.
Deleting from your internet now.
Yeah, but now it's all about the Google deletion, right? It's all about Google now limiting slowly, like the frog in the warm water, not really seeing what they're taking out, and we're missing information. What has been your research on that, a part of the Patriot Act and the 9/11 disaster?
Well, I'll tell you something very relevant to that. As I said earlier, researched through 2001, 2002 for the first book, Alice in Wonderland, about 9/11. And I researched this time. It's much, much harder to find information about 9/11 now than it was then. There's clear Google search engine suppression of 9/11 information. And
for example?
Well, I mean, there's just not the information there that there was before. You have to get
like the videos.
You have to get your search words perfect almost to get the information, because of course they're hiding it, so it's not on the early pages and it's much harder to find. And what you're also getting, of course, which kind of is utterly ludicrous, but it's par for the course, is whenever you go into, for instance, YouTube, and you see a video that's questioning 9/11, you are faced with a posting underneath from YouTube, which is sending people to Wikipedia to get the official story. I've posted interviews the last few days with Princeton professors, experts in carbon dioxide, talking about the way that carbon dioxide is being massively misrepresented by the climate cult, which it is fundamentally. And underneath these Princeton professor interviews, you've got YouTube sending people to Wikipedia to find out about climate change. So this is how far it's gone. And it's for simple reason. When I talked earlier about know the outcome and you'll see the journey, the outcome of all this, and this is where it's planned to go, is to have a situation where no one will ever see anything in terms of information that has not been approved by the state. The global state is where they want it to go. And what we're seeing now is the step-by-step totalitarian tiptoe deletion of alternative information so that we're moving towards that position. Now, what is free speech? It's the freedom to speak. And while you've got the freedom to speak and communicate, they can never reach that situation of total control of what people see and hear. So freedom of speech, from their point of view, has to go to reach their goal. And we're seeing freedom of speech being targeted in every which way now by the Silicon Valley giants as, in all their different forms, but also by this woke mentality, this social justice warrior mentality, which has hijacked the left and turned it into a tyranny, which is targeting freedom of speech. They're deplatforming people. Anyone that doesn't agree with them has to be silenced. And of course, when they demand that happens to people on social media or the internet, these Silicon Valley giants and their billionaires are saying, oh, yes, we'll do that. Oh, we'd love to. And so
ironically, David, real quick here, today, YouTube, December 10th, is the second purging of many alternative of shows on YouTube. And that's where I think people have to realize that you're absolutely right. This is where we're going, and it's happening right in front of our eyes, although it's done very, deceitfully.
Well, you see, this is the thing, you can see the world as a blaze of pixels, or you can see it as a picture. And to see the picture, you've got to connect the dots. And so when you see the Silicon Valley giant corporations as individual, then you see it in a certain way. When you realize that if you go deep enough into those corporations, they're controlled by the same force, then you can see how this coordination can take place to a long-planned end. And of course, it's simple with YouTube and Google because Google owns YouTube. And so YouTube are moving against this information. Facebook are moving against it. Twitter increasingly, and so on. And you've got Amazon, which has been developed on one level specifically to completely hijack the book distribution and publishing market. It's
53% of all books. 53% of all books published in America are bought on Amazon.
Yeah,
you're right.
It's destroyed so many small publishers and independent bookshops. And this is the idea. This is how it works. This is what's happened with Facebook. It's what's happened with Google. It's what's in the process of happening with Amazon. You have limitless funding because the cabal's funding you. So while you're building your monopoly and getting more and more control of your market, you don't have to make a profit. Your competitors do. So they're at a fundamental disadvantage. So what you do in the early years, whether it's Amazon or Facebook or Google or YouTube, you've got to get this market monopoly and this massive market share. To do that, you have to do what people want. So for years, we've had the free flow of information on these platforms. Once they reach their near monopoly and they are unassailable in the way they dictate that market, i.e. Amazon, etc., that's when they say, okay, gloves off, now we start to become what we were always planned to be, and then they start deleting people and deleting books and deleting videos and platforms and channels, and they say, well, okay, you got a problem. What are you going to do? Who else are you going to go to? There is no one else. We've destroyed them all, basically. And this is how it works.
This is the 1984 experience that we are involved in as of right now, which you refer to often too in your books, and especially in The Trigger. And we'll get into the planes. I know you covered a lot about the planes and why, and so many people who are not aware of that. I just want to ask one other question in reference to the outcome of The Trigger, the catalyst, how it's going to affect all of us, how it is affecting us now. And not like you said, we got censorship now. We are losing our Bill of Rights. People come and arrest us at any given time, whatever definition they want to create next. So these pieces are in place, right? As well as now as the gun confiscation, as well as the targeting conservatives around the world.
Co-opting religion.
And co-opting, yes. So all of this is occurring simultaneously from this one moment in time, as you call The Trigger, the 9/11 Commission. So is that an aspect of us going in from the destabilization into already the crisis, or are we still in the destabilization waiting for the crisis? and the trigger was just to be part of it.
Good question.
The destabilization has been going on a long time. I mean, you're referring to a former KGB agent who went to America and spilled the beans on how societies are transformed. And he was talking about the fact that you need 2 or 3 generations in the schools and universities to be controlled and indoctrinated before you start to transform society. And that's exactly what we're seeing. This woke social justice mentality, which talks about inclusivity while creating exclusivity, that talks about being anti-racist while being blatantly racist, is the product of this programming, this indoctrination, specific political indoctrination through several generations. And what happens eventually is those people that have been through that programming, and climate change is going to destroy human life, is also in that programming, which is why so many young people believe it. And then they start to come out into the adult world, and they start going into politics, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is a classic outgrowth of this control of the education system, or what passes for it. This is all part of this transformation of society, because they have a date period which comes up again and again, which is 2030, when they want so much of this in place. And by then, the young people they've been putting through this program machine through these generations will be the adults. And that's why they're targeting them, so that they will be pliable when it comes to the big push to introduce this full blown. So it's going on. It's going on now. And it's testament to the effectiveness of the programming that you have not all young people, my goodness, there's a heck of a lot who've seen through it, and good on them, because they've been subjected to so much perceptual programming. But large numbers have, the social justice warriors, etc., have.
Hook, line, and sinker. Yeah.
To the point where they are now, in the name of climate change and inclusivity and political correctness, demanding that the system takes their own freedom away for the rest of their life, because that's what they're demanding. And you see now this extraordinary alliance between apparently left-wing people and billionaires. So you have George Soros as a hero of the social justice warrior woke mentality, when he's a billionaire who has said that he doesn't take any account of the social consequences of what he does in his finance, because he's just there to make money. Why would he be funding all these left of center so-called progressive groups when he couldn't give a damn about social justice? Why? Because it's all part of this perceptual programming. And what they've now got is this army of young people who are demanding that freedom of speech is taken away. It's an absolute inversion. When you see pictures from Berkeley in the 60s of students on mass marches demanding freedom of speech, now they protest demanding it's taken away. This is the scale of the perceptual inversion that's taken place. And what then follows is that people in general, because this is a point I would strongly make, and you will know this is true, there is such a difference, phenomenal difference, between the shrill voices that dominate the microphones and the men and women in mainstream society, what you call in America Main Street. They do not think like the social justice warriors. They do not think like the political correct tyrants. So they don't think like the Washington bubble. but they don't get to the microphone. So the policy and the pressure on politicians to conform and to take the country in a certain direction comes from these shrill voices, not least because the same cabal that's behind this owns the mainstream media, and so the shrill voices are getting all the promotion and all the pushing of it. And people who don't meet a lot of other people will be thinking, well, am I the only one that thinks like I do? Everyone seems to think that this political correct nonsense is how it should be. Am I the only one? No, you're not. You're not. Nothing like.